Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Soil Tent. I'm Philippa Clarke, and I would like to introduce Merlin Sheldrake, author of Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. Thank you for joining us, Merlin.
It's great to be here.
Brilliant. So, obviously, Groundswell is all about the soil, all about fungi, but where did your interest start?
Well, I grew up in a household with a biologist as a father, and me and my brother were always encouraged to take an interest in the living world and the other lives unfolding around us. And it's hard to take an interest in the other lives unfolding around us without asking questions which will sooner or later lead back to fungi. And for me, those questions began with decomposition. How do things change from one state to another? How does a log turn into compost? How does this kitchen waste that I'm taking out every week into the garden turn into compost, which we then put onto the flower beds? And so these concerns of mine with how things change led to questions about how things change, and led to answers that were all about fungi and the microbes that oversee these processes. And I was enthralled. And it seemed like magic, and still does, really, when I think about it. The more I think about it, the more astonishing it seems. So that was one way in. And then mushrooms, seeing mushrooms walking around and being amazed at how fast they could appear and disappear again. And then later on, my interest in symbiosis and how organisms have found and constantly inventing new ways to live alongside one another. And that led me into the study of mycorrhizal fungi and plants, and from there on and on.
Fantastic. So, did you ever expect your book to reach such a wide audience? You know, it's become in the mainstream when it's a non-fiction based on something quite rogue and specific, I would say, and everyone's read it.
I'm pleasantly surprised. I always thought of it as a nerdy book about a historically unglamorous subject. But of course, the point of writing a book like this and writing a book for a general audience is to reach a general audience. So it's been really rewarding to see it find unexpected readers and to touch people.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the fact that it wasn't all facts. It seemed like you really focused on the description, and your sense of awe really came across, and I felt that too. Was that quite important to you when you were writing it?
Definitely. There are plenty of scientific papers about fungi, and there are plenty of textbooks about fungi. And so I didn't feel like I needed to write one of those. And so story is so important. Story illuminates a subject. And it's about hospitality, really, writing something in order for people to read. When you're writing a scientific paper, at least when I've been writing scientific papers in the past, I have a nagging sense that no one's actually going to read this. It's a bit demoralizing after a while. But with this, I thought, well, this is really about hospitality. I've got to invite people into this book, and I've got to make them feel like they want to stay. And so when you're thinking about other people's feelings, then it's a story, a metaphor, analogy, the imagery, the tone. That becomes very important.
Oh, brilliant. For anyone that may have not finished the book yet or read it, would you be able to summarise why fungi is so important?
Well, it would take several books.
Briefly.
I think probably the simplest way to say it is that fungi and the activities of fungi and their remarkable relationships underpin the regenerative capacity of the biosphere. And so everything that we think of as life exists within the biosphere and has been shaped by the activity of fungi for over 1 billion years. So they are the players, sometimes hidden players, sometimes less hidden players, behind so many of the things that we depend on, so many of the processes we depend on, the foods we eat, the clothes we wear, for example, or land plants depend on fungi. There would not be such thing as this terrestrial biosphere were it not for the relationships that the ancestors of land plants struck up with fungi, with the ancestors of mycorrhizal fungi. No plants, obviously that would be a very different place. So that's one way to think of it. Obviously, we could follow that through and these different strands through human life and human history, whether it be medicines or agricultural practices or anything involving plants, food. and then it goes on. But
Yeah, definitely a huge field that we're only now really at the precipice. Why do you think it's taken so long for us to recognise the importance of fungi?
It's such an important point, right? Fungi are a kingdom of life. That's as broad a category as animals or plants, but they have not had a kingdom's worth of attention. And I think there are a few reasons for this. I think on a basic level, most fungi live most of their lives out of our sight, out of the reach of our immediate, unaided senses. And so it's difficult to access their lives. It's difficult to study them. Even today, with the cutting-edge technology and with huge scientific budgets, it's difficult to ask questions about fungi. So I think that's one basic level that they are just they're hard for us to access. But then there are taxonomic and categorical reasons as well. It was only in the late 60s that plants won their independence, taxonomically speaking, and were recognized as a kingdom of life. Until this point, they were thought of as lower plants, which meant they got studied in the dusty and unglamorous corner of botany schools. There weren't the same levels of funding, of research interests of students, and all the other things that organisms benefit from when they are recognized as a kingdom. And then there are all sorts of cultural reasons. Lots of people find them gross. And they associate with decay and death. And of course, thinking of death as the end is just one way of thinking about it. It's just as easy to think about death as the beginning. But I think these have implanted some cultural biases. These associations have implanted some cultural biases that have stuck with us, certainly in the British Isles. Depends where you look. In East Asian cultures, in China and Japan, Korea, fungi have been revered and eaten and used as medicines and celebrated for a very long time.
Yeah. I mean, fungi I've heard being described as the gateway between life and death, and they bridge that gap. But without the fungi, we would have no life. So surely they should be celebrated. And as you're saying, in some cultures they are. Like, there's a big history of using them in ceremonies, and there's a lot of work that's being done now on psilocybin. I find that really interesting. If you could explain why they're so beneficial.
Well, it's really interesting, this resurgence of research into psychedelics more generally. Of course, human history and psychedelics go back, they're deeply entwined. Humans have used psychoactive plants and fungi and animals for an unknowably long time, and these organisms have found their way into human cultures, become venerated, deified, celebrated in all sorts of different ways. So in many of these cultures, these mind-altering organisms are known to help loosen the categories of our thoughts and feelings, help us into new states of awareness and connection, help us heal from different problems. And so in this sense, this new wave of interest and the new wave of findings about psychedelics is catching up with what many humans have long understood. It's interesting that this new wave is taking place a lot with psilocybin. LSD was heavily stigmatized after the 60s and the colorful activities and battles that went on there. So, yeah, many of these modern papers are taking place with psilocybin, which is a fungal compound produced by magic mushrooms. Hey, look, there's a robot. I've been wanting to see these agricultural robots for so long.
I think they've come to see you.
Robot weeders are the things I really want to see. I've been hearing so much about them. I've never seen one. Never seen a picture of one. So many of the studies into psilocybin have investigated the effects of psilocybin on intractable diseases of our minds and spirits, psycho-spiritual diseases like depression or addiction, the sorts of things that modern medicine is not so good at treating. Modern medicine is very good at treating things like, anything involves surgery. It comes out of a mechanistic paradigm, and if you think about your body in mechanistic terms, then sure, then surgery will be very helpful. But the mind's very difficult to think about in mechanistic terms, because it's not really a thing. And and you can't touch it and make pictures of it. So there are big holes in our ability to cure mental problems, mental health issues. Many of these involving depression and addiction in different forms. So many of these studies have found, a number of these studies have found, that taking psychedelics allows people to step outside the rigid habits, their thought, the rigid pessimism that surrounds depression, for example, to see old problems from new angles, to gain a new perspective on their life and see a new view from what they'd experienced before. And this can be enormously helpful for many people. And of course, these are early days, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done as this scales up, but it's an exciting time to follow that subject.
Yeah, it really is. And so a lot of people, after having one of these treatments, will say that they feel a more connectedness to nature and a bit more of a spiritual view. And could that come from the fungi being, that's like their survival advantage, and tying humans to nature will enable fungi to better survive?
It's a good question. Why organisms produce psychoactive substances has long confused humans. In the case of psilocybin mushrooms, it's difficult to link tightly to humans because the first magic mushrooms, the best guess we have, the first magic mushrooms arose about 75 million years ago, which is some time before the genus Homo evolved. So whatever psilocybin evolved to do, it's unlikely that it was to do with humans. It seems much more likely that it was to do with the insects that eat and compete with this sort of decaying, dung-loving fungi. What it was supposed to do to insects is hard to know. It's very difficult to research this. It's surprisingly difficult to get a license to give psilocybin to flies. Thankfully, things are changing. Some people say, well, the psilocybin would have helped to put off these insect fungivores by taking their mind off their next meal. Some people say instead that no, the psilocybin could have acted as some kind of a lure and help these insects, help the fungi attract the insects, which would then spread their spores. Both are possible. Today there are insects that make their homes in psilocybin mushrooms, and so obviously not too confused by the substance. There are other insects that might avoid psilocybin. So anyway, so psilocybin, it's a potent activator of animal nervous systems. Whatever it evolved to do in the first place, it does seem to be to do with animal nervous systems. They're not human nervous systems. Of course, these things change over time, and so since magic mushrooms were reintroduced in a big way in the 50s and 60s, a new story of domestication is underway. A handful of tropical species have found their way into all sorts of improbable scenarios. They've been growing in warehouses, in temperate climates, and under people's beds, in wardrobes, on their windowsills. And people are making new strains, and it's a very rapid period of change. And so there's no question that these species have benefited from their ability to influence human minds, that the psychedelic experience is somehow, in this case, a lure that's drawing humans into a new kind of a relationship. So, it's a tangled tale.
Yeah. One of my favourite parts of your book was hearing the story about the zombie ants and how the mushrooms sort of take over their brain. Could that happen to us?
It hasn't been formally documented that they're called the entomopathogenic fungi, the fungi that can grow into insect bodies, puppet their behaviour in some way that benefits the fungus. It's evolved multiple times across the fungal kingdom. So it's clearly a good idea, evolutionarily speaking. There's not been documented that an entomopathogenic fungus can survive in a mammal body. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Doesn't mean it hasn't been observed to happen, just hasn't been written up and described formally. But there would be challenges, a different set of challenges these fungi would face when growing inside a mammal body. Our bodies are hot, for example, which tends to put off most fungi. So I would say that we don't have much to worry about at this point from those fungi. There are other pathogenic fungi of humans which we are enabling by liberally applying fungicides and weakening the effect of many of our most powerful fungal defences, as we are with antibiotics as well. But so I think our concerns should lie elsewhere.
Brilliant, thank you. So why maybe focus more back on the soil. And we know that fungi can greatly affect the yield of crops. Why is it not possible just to insert fungi into the soil and everyone's happy and we get a much bigger yield of crop?
Well, there are lots of ways to be a fungus. This is the kingdom of life. It's a bit like saying, why don't we just insert plants into this ecosystem and get the benefit of plants? Obviously, it depends which plants. Even within one given species of plant, it depends which cultivars, which varieties. And it's the same with mycorrhizal fungi. There are lots of different mycorrhizal fungal families. There are different mycorrhizal strains within different mycorrhizal species. There are locally adapted mycorrhizal communities which will work together and do certain things, have certain activities when together in combination. And so it's not a straightforward question of just adding mycorrhizal fungi and expecting it to work. Within the lifetime of a given plant and a given mycorrhizal fungus, the relationship can change over time. Symbiosis is really a continuum which can slither from mutualism on one end to parasitism on another. And if you have one plant, one fungus, and over the course of their lives, both partners will benefit. But sometimes, if you took a snapshot, the plant might be giving more than it gets. Another snapshot, the fungus might be giving more than it gets. So unless you think about the whole lifetime of this relationship, you're going to miss the full picture. So it's very nuanced.
Yeah. Is there a way? Could we tap into the mycorrhizal network and learn to understand how they communicate? And would that be a good way of sort of establishing the soil health or measuring it?
I certainly think we can pay attention to mycorrhizal networks and pay attention to the relationships that they're forming with plants, to pay attention to the trade that's going on between plant and fungus and how that changes over time, how that changes depending on what we're doing. A study just came out very recently in the last few days where they looked at a forest, long-term fertilization experiments in boreal forests and found that, and paid attention to it's called the metatranscriptome. So the different genes which are being produced by the plant and the fungus. So this analysis tells you not only who's there, but what everyone's doing at a given moment. And it's a remarkable study. It shows how when you add fertilizer, you can see the activity of the fungi change. You can see the fungal community start to shift. You can see the plant genes that are being expressed start to shift. And the whole chemical conversation that's going on between plant and microbes shifting in time. And I think that kind of temporal resolution, that way of paying attention to what's going on underground as a process in time is really exciting and potentially very informative. These analyses are still very expensive, so I think it'll be a little while before we see that happening regularly in people's fields, but I don't think it's inconceivable that could be happening before long.
Brilliant. Is it the same with fungi that when you add fertilizer it can make them lazy and it can disrupt this relationship between plants and fungi and maybe make it more of a mutualistic one?
Yes, so when it's quite commonly found that when you add fertilizer, the plant has less incentive to send carbon below the ground and invest in its symbiotic partners. And so that changes life for the fungi, and it can make the fungi behave in ways which are less beneficial for the plant. Therefore, the fungi has to fight to keep its foothold in that carbon poor environment, or carbon poorer environment. And many crops have been bred over the course of the 20th century without taking much account of their symbiotic lives underground. So we've bred strains and cultivars which are symbiotically dysfunctional, which aren't able to form really healthy relationships with these symbionts because they've been bred under incredibly high phosphorus regimes, for example. So one of the exciting things moving forward with breeding is to think about breeding for the whole plant, including its relationships. And that's what I mean by the whole plant.
Yeah, because if 90% of plants are dependent on their fungi relationships, can you really call them separate individuals?
I love these questions. And it's I think it's really important to ask them. Plants evolved with mycorrhizal fungi, and in fact the relationships that were formed between plants' ancestors and the ancestors of mycorrhizal fungi some 450 million years ago these relationships are hugely fundamental. The fungi behaved as plant root systems for tens of millions of years until plants evolved their own roots. This makes fungal relationships a more fundamental part of planthood than leaves or flowers or fruit or wood or many of the other things that we think of as plant traits. So I really do think about these relationships as part of the plant, that what we think of as plants are fungi that have evolved to farm algae, and algae which have evolved to farm algae. Fungi, sorry.
So if you were to begin the research again and the taxonomic system hadn't been created, would you do it the same way, or would you just focus on the relationships between organisms rather than putting them into separate categories?
It would be very hard to think of a taxonomy that didn't involve categories, and so I think I would end up in a similar place, just starting intuitively from just from my own experience of the world without high-tech equipment, DNA sequencing. But I think there's opportunity to change the way we think about these categories, so that the way that the evolutionary tree has normally been thought of is it's made up of branches. Once a lineage has branched into two branches, those two branches remain separate. They branch into further branches and further branches. But actually, lots of organisms arise when these branches fuse together, when they come together and melt into a new lineage. Lichens are a great example of this. Lichens are symbiotic organisms formed when fungi come together with algae, come together with bacteria. And very distant branches of the evolutionary tree fuse into the lineage, which is now that lichen. And this is happening all the time in different ways. And so it makes it very complicated for people who want to name lichens. Lichens have traditionally been named after the dominant fungus in the relationship. But the same dominant fungus can form multiple different lichens that look very different. They're all called the same thing, even though they're evidently not. Yeah. So I think there's room to loosen some of these categories and start to think maybe of the tree of life as more of a mycelium of life, which fuses as well as branches.
Yeah, definitely. Fungi, they're so different from an animal and so different from a plant. It's if it was on a scale, what would you put them more towards?
Well, in evolutionary terms, they're more closely related to animals, but I think of them as distinct. I would I think I spend so much time trying to encourage people to think of them as not plants. Yeah. And myself to use mycologically inclusive language. People might say mushrooms are it's harder than you think. For example, when you see a mushroom, you say that's a fruiting body. Well, is it a fruiting body? It's perfectly reasonable to say that it's analogous to a fruit in the plant, but actually it's a sporing body. It does a very different thing. It's more like a cross between a fruit and a flower. So anyway, I like all these ways that fungi encourage us to think in new ways about the living world and loosen these.
And that's helped by the psilocybin too.
Well, I mean, if you took psilocybin and looked at some of these taxonomic papers, it would definitely loosen. I don't know how many taxonomists are taking psilocybin and then doing taxonomy, but it'd be an interesting study.
So the fungi help in the soil to capture the carbon and sequester it. So I would say that's pretty fundamental, or it is fundamental to what's going on here and solving the climate crisis. How do we apply it more strongly now that we have this information?
So, there are lots of ways that fungi help carbon enter the soil. The soil, as we'll all know, is a big store of carbon, terrestrial carbon, and mycorrhizal fungi in particular, because they're receiving photosynthates from the plant. They're stationed at the entry point of carbon into soil food webs. They're kind of gatekeepers of that flow. And then once the carbon gets underground, a lot of it remains as recalcitrant compounds produced by mycorrhizal fungi, or as in fungal necromass, or just bound up in the aggregates that the fungal mycelium creates by being a kind of sticky three-dimensional web. So are there ways that we can take this into account when we're trying to adapt to climate challenges? And there are. And so if you're making decisions based on the carbon that's coming into the soil through mycorrhizal networks, it might inform the way that you restore a landscape, for example. It might affect the way that you make conservation priorities. More and more, there's this work on grasslands and the amount of carbon that's coming down under grasslands, old growth grasslands in particular. Thinking about that soil carbon would mean that these grasslands would feature higher in your list of priorities. So fairly basic decision-making processes, I think, can be informed by this. And then on to more global study. Are there areas of the world where you find carbon sequestration hotspots enabled by particular types of mycorrhizal fungi? Can those fungi be cultured? Can those cultured fungi be introduced to other parts of the world or into other crops to different parts of the world? These are all major questions to ask. And then other ways that our practices are damaging the ability of fungal networks to sequester carbon, and there are plenty of ways that we're damaging the ability of fungal networks to sequestering carbon. So just by stopping those damaging practices, we will allow them to get on with it.
Yeah. And in these places where you've got the hotspots of fungi that are good at sequestering carbon, do you think that's a good idea to then culture it and get it into sort of the crop fields? Or do you think that's sort of going a bit down the same monoculture route, and that we should be encouraging diversity and more in the natural way?
I totally think we should be encouraging diversity. I think it's important to pay attention to the different ways that different fungi have found to solve problems. But certainly don't think that we should culture these fungi and then spread them around the world and in that way without thinking very carefully about what else they're doing in the ecosystems. I don't think it's feasible that actually these fungi would be able to do that anyway, because they have very specific ecological needs. There are some very widespread generalist mycorrhizal fungi, weedy species that you can find all over the place, and you find frequently in commercial inoculums. And so this is already happening. People are buying commercial inoculums and spreading these potentially weedy species, which might not be benefiting the plants at all. In fact, they might be causing plants to grow less and spreading them all over the place. And this is not, I don't think, discussed enough.
No. Is there not the science that's looked into that yet? Or is it just they think it's a magic bullet, magic pill? And
most of the mycorrhizal scientists that I speak to and who I work with are very suspicious of most commercial inoculums. Not all. There are some fascinating studies that have come out recently which are looking at whole soil, complex mycorrhizal communities isolated from local intact ecosystems and cultured as communities from local areas, which show clear benefit when introduced to local communities of plants. But many commercial inoculums don't pay so much attention to the local needs of these local plants, and so I think that's when we get into trouble. And there are many people making many different sorts of inoculum, but I think the question is always how ecologically sensitive is the thinking behind it. Yeah,
definitely. I would. There's a lot of research at the moment showing the importance of the gut microbiome and its diversity, and I would see a lot of parallels with that with fungal research, the Mycelium network. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's equivalent to when you see a lot of these the booming industry for human probiotics. Most of the species that you find in these commercial supplements, they're not the A-listers in your gut. They're the ones that are easy to cultivate in production facilities, often the Z-listers. And you're buying them and putting them into your body in large quantities. Maybe they're not going to do much. Maybe they'll help a little bit. Who knows? But I think it's a little bit like that with many of these commercial inoculums. It's not, so the thinking is not, what do these plants in this place need, but what can we produce quickly and easily?
Yeah, perfect. So how is it that the fungi network helps restore the health of the soil? The World Wide Web is a phrase often associated.
The Wood Wide Web.
Wood Wide Web.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways, and I think very important to remember that these are fungal networks, not one fungal network. There are situations where you could have lots of plants of the same species which might be sharing a network or sharing overlapping networks. There might be situations where you have a group of plants who are connected to one community of mycorrhizal fungi, and then another group of plants who are connected to quite a different group. And then you have all the decomposer fungi who are grinding through the soil as well, interfacing with roots, with dead roots, root litter, who are living off exudates produced by the plant, in complex, tangled relationships with the mycorrhizal fungi, who themselves are in complex relationships with the bacteria who surf along the slimy films on the outside of fungal hyphae, like highways through the soil. Fungi have microbiomes like us, and bacteria travel through fungal networks as well, and often enable mycorrhizal fungi to do what they do, to form healthy relationships with plants. If you cure them of their bacterial microbiomes, many mycorrhizal fungi can't form healthy relationships with plants. So hugely complicated, complex networks, and very difficult for us to actually access these networks, find out what's going on at a given time in a natural ecosystem or a cultivated ecosystem, because as soon as you intervene, you've damaged it. So a lot of what we know is from lab studies or cultured studies, and we extrapolate out with caveats. So there are lots of ways that these networks help plants. Fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, are not just nutrient providers for plants. They condition plants' immune systems, which evolve, like our immune systems, as much to manage your resident populations of microbes, as much to manage their resident populations of microbes, as they do to defend some unassailable boundary from self from other. And so plants' immune systems work because they have been trained, and they've been trained in relationship with these fungi, relationship with these bacteria. Plants are defended by a kind of active fungal firewall. Plant leaves are filled with fungi as well, and plant shoots. And these fungi sometimes don't do very much, but also they sometimes crowd out or prevent pathogenic fungi from getting a foothold. So there's the health and disease angle as well. There's drought, provision of water. Mycorrhizal fungi are very nimble compared to plant roots and can supply plants with water and help them resist drought as well. Salinity, heavy metal toxicity. There are lots and lots of benefits besides the indirect benefits of holding the soil together. Mycorrhizal fungal mycelium makes up between 1/3 and 1/2 of soil biomass. This is a sticky living seam that holds the soil together. Take away the fungi and the ground would wash away. And so there are lots of ways to think about this as creating the very environment in which plants take root as well.
Yeah, definitely. So the fungi can be infected just like we can. Yeah, and that can, would that infection then spread across the whole network?
Well, you mean if the fungus was infected by
a parasite?
Oh, well, fungi, well, they have their own problems. They have bacterial infections, have viral infections. And what they do to plants depends on what they're infected by. There's a great study recently with a fungus which causes watery soft rot. And when this fungus, this pathogen, is infected by a certain virus, it not only stopped causing this awful disease, but it became beneficial to the plant. It defended the plant from other similar pathogens, and all it took was a viral infection. There are many ways that what we might think of as complex partners for us as humans trying to cultivate plants, fungi that cause problems in our crops. There are many ways that relationship could change in a moment, depending on what that fungus is relating to.
Yeah. And as you said, it's a very complicated network that we're only able to study it in the lab at the moment. And when you extrapolate up the findings, how accurate do you think they are? Because looking at one fungal network in a small tub of soil compared to a whole forest, there must be quite a few differences.
Certainly, and so I should qualify that. When it's very difficult to study the actual physical architecture of networks in the field, in natural environments, or outside the lab, rather. But we can study, we can take samples, we can find out who's living there, and we can find out a little bit what they're doing. It's just that it's harder to track, to watch things move through a network. It's harder to do very precise experiments with one network connecting the roots of, say, two roots, and to look how carefully how material is passing through that shared network. So the question of extrapolation is a big one for anyone studying science. We do experiments, and then we try to generalize from those experiments. And many of the tools that we use, repetition, and replication, statistics, different ways of managing uncertainty, contending with uncertainty. These are all tools, but it's something which is always difficult to do. It's why you need to have science which is taking place in labs and science which is taking place at a more ecological level and biosphere level as well. It's not an easy question to answer.
No, yeah, and mycology has been a field that has benefited a lot from amateur research. Do you think that will continue to be the case?
Certainly. And it's really one of the interesting things about mycology, and too often it's because there hasn't been anywhere else for those mycologically passionate individuals to go. No university departments and very few opportunities to pursue the study of fungi. And so the amateur organization, the DIY mycology scene is a bustling place, and is still a bustling place. And so I think this is something that we'll continue to see, and which is really set in. It's got a good foothold. And seeing in different parts of biology, there's biohackers, labs set up in different ways in different places, and it's very exciting to see people who aren't formally trained as scientists being able to participate in biological studies. It's almost like that's coming back to a DIY culture, so animal or plant biology coming back to a DIY culture, which has always existed in a big way within mycology. So I think there's definitely a trend towards this kind of citizen science and citizen exploration, and I think very welcome.
Yeah.
You can ask different questions. You're not constrained by the need to apply for a certain type of grant. You're not constrained by the need to teach students for a certain type of examination. You might have come from a completely different field, have a totally different way of thinking about problems, and so the more minds from different backgrounds thinking about these puzzles, I think the better.
Yeah, it definitely requires innovative thinking and a broader question than most focus in science is so specific. You need outside of the box thinking. Mm-hmm. But there's only been 6% of fungi discovered yet, I think, or species identified.
It's hard to know exactly, but there's between 3 and 6 million species of fungi. That's a big margin of uncertainty. Over 90% of which remain undescribed.
Wow.
And so it's hard to guess how many species there are that you haven't described, but it's possible to make estimations. Mm-hmm. But it's a tiny minority of the fungal world that we know about.
Mm. Are you excited? You must be so excited by what's going to come with this. If only this small amount we know, could you hazard a guess at what the other 90% of species are capable of?
It's impossible to know. The more I study fungi, the more amazed I am by them. Mm. It doesn't get less amazing and less astonishing. And so I've learned just to be surprised and not to think that I know what's in front of me.
Yeah, not put a lid on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your book was published a couple of years ago, and with it there's now been this big momentum into mycology. Is there any new advances in the field that you would have included in your book now?
Good question. There's been all sorts of studies, different aspects of fungal life, and a lot of it would be further examples that I would give to support a point that I would make in the book. There's been obviously more research into psychedelics. There's been more research into mycorrhizal fungi, cultivation of mycorrhizal fungi, culturing and applying those cultures. There's been amazing work in fungal ecology, looking at a very big scale, like what global distributions, who's living where, how are those distributions changing, how might they change in the future. So big scale ecological questions. There's been much more work on, there's always quite a lot of work on fungal drugs and fungal medicine because they've had a big role in human health for a very long time. That's well established. In industry, alternative protein sources, that's a big deal. And different fermentation styles and methods. Fermentation is getting a lot more interest recently, which is really exciting because it's an ancient human practice, and I think like many of these traditional human practices can benefit from the tools that we have now in modern science, and those two streams coming together. So there's a lot that's happening and will happen in the coming years. No doubt.
Yeah, very exciting. And do you think farmers can definitely play a role in this, as we were saying, with it's amateurs, a lot of amateurs doing the research? So do you think there's potential for organisations to be set up where, or even if there already is, where farmers can start to measure their mycelial networks?
Certainly. I think that would be a really welcome development. I suppose you can think about every farmer's decisions on every farm as a kind of experiment. And you see this when people talk about baselines, taking baseline measurements. So sharing the results of these experiments, sharing ideas. This whole regenerative agricultural movement, which is thinking about the life in the soil, turning our attention to the soil as a living place, rather than just as sort of a black box, a dead black box where you put things, put nutrients or other chemicals. This is really a welcome change, and I think there's all sorts of ways that that a communicating, motivated network of curious cultivators can advance the state of fungal knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And they seem to be. I know you're close or friends with Paul Stamets, and his TED talk was 6 ways fungi can save the world. And in your book, you reference a furniture company and building companies that are using fungi to make these things as biodegradable solutions. And it is that sort of innovative thinking that will then allow all these solutions that Paul's talking about to come through. What else do you see happening?
So there are so many things, and so much of it is not necessarily a new concept, like microfabrication, using mycelium to build stuff. That's for many people a new concept. A lot of the time it's just new variations on a very old theme. But there's microfabrication, making different kinds of material, making leather-like materials, fabric-like materials. This is a stop alarm. And there are, it's a bit like what I just said, actually, all these different ways that people are, or the kinds of studies that we're seeing, the kinds of innovation that we're seeing all across. But starting to think about these as connected. People have always been able to study fungi in pathology, the plant pathology departments. And people have been able to study fungi in applied fungal industry, producing enzymes or producing citric acid using mold, or producing penicillin using growing fungi in fermenting vats. But I'm excited to see what happens when these different branches of fungal knowledge and applied fungal knowledge start coming together and working together and thinking about the lives of these organisms in the round, and learning from, say, the ecologists, or learning from the cell biologists, and starting to piece this together as a body of knowledge about a kingdom of life.
Yeah, it's like they were talking about in the earlier tent. All these separate, different and distinct compartments need to start communicating together, because none can exist and none can change without that.
And fungi lead us into interconnected worldviews by forming living networks that form persistent physical connections between different organisms. They embody the basic principle of ecology, that of the relationships between organisms. And I think thinking from the fungal point of view can really take us into this this place of joined up thinking, as people say, and ecological awareness, and thinking about the connections between things and processes as much as the things and processes doing the connecting.
Fantastic. I've just got one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. But so fungal networks, they allow the transportation of nutrients or water from very nutrient-dense areas to nutrient-poor, and sort of they'll help a young seedling grow. And that, in turn, builds the biodiversity of the whole community. And I guess my question is, I think our society could learn a lot from that. If maybe we should start try to live like they do.
Well, it's a dangerous game. I mean, do you want to live like the fungi that grow into ants' bodies and cut their brains off from their muscles and puppet their every move and mummify them while they're still alive? Do you want to live like the fungi that grow into plants and kill them in days? Like, do you want to? I mean, there's so many ways to eat a fungus, and there are so many fungal behaviours which transplanted to human life would be deeply unsavory and unwelcome. So I think we should always be careful when we try to naturalize our behaviors in those of quite different organisms. And but yeah, I think there's certainly lessons we can learn from fungi about interconnectedness, about waste, reframing our dysfunctional philosophies of waste, about thinking about life as a process rather than living organisms as processes rather than things. Fungal networks never stop growing, they never stop exploring, never fully grown. They're always in the process of becoming, as are you. But it's easier to think about yourself or other atomized mobile animals as things than processes. To think about the importance of what lies beneath, what lies unseen, what we haven't paid attention to, what we can't see and what we can't notice so readily, how important these things are. There are so many lessons from fungi. In danger of romanticising maybe myself. Has anyone got any questions?
Just wait for the microphone.
Oh. As a, oh, sorry.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you were saying about the sort of outsider DIY community investigating mycology. However, it seems to me that at least when it comes to psychedelics, there seems to be quite a big corporate interest and big money. So I guess it would be interesting to see your take on that monetization of a kind of psycho-spiritual experience.
Yeah, it's really, really complicated and problematic. There's no doubt about it. Many of these substances which are being commodified have been used and known about by traditional knowledge, digital societies, and known about within traditional knowledge systems for a very long time. And so there is a lot of extractive, exploitative behavior that goes on there. A lot of this monetization and privatization of this knowledge will exclude people who could benefit from these medicines. The pharmaceutical industry is a big problem space, as many of us will be aware, for all sorts of reasons. So, yeah, I'm concerned watching it develop. But also there are so many different... It's so hard to know how this will unfold, because all of these companies, whether they're being super corporate about it or whether they're being more charitable about it, it's hard for them to guess what's going to happen with psychedelics, because this is all trying to second guess the legal developments that are about to unfold, haven't yet unfolded. So who knows what the legal landscape will be in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, and how these companies will be able to actually operate. A lot of this is about the promise of these compounds. So there are lots of different models of people trying to work with the promise or the different promises of these compounds, and so it's a state of great flux. But yeah, I second your concern.
Oh, I'd just like to know what your thoughts are about kombucha and Scoobies. Tell us about that.
Scobies. I love kombucha. I make kombucha. I'm a keen fermenter. I love fermentation because it's a way of domesticating decomposition, rehousing rot. And within jars and bottles, you can have waves of microbial populations rising and falling in each other's wake in succession. It's enacting ecological dynamics, which is very much what's going on in the biosphere. You know, we live in the biosphere, which is made up of biogeochemical cycles operating on a vast scale. It's very hard for us to notice. And in your jar or bottle, you have a kind of microcosm of the living world, and you can taste it. You can taste how those chemical changes are unfolding with your own mouth. So I find it really illuminating, besides being delicious and captivating in other ways.
Hi. Thanks for the talk and the book, which I totally love, big fan. As is my daughter, 21-year-old daughter, who reading product design and determined to dedicate her working life to mycelium. Who should she talk to? Where should she look? Who's doing amazing things in
Also, the big companies working on it, there's one called Ecovative Design in the States. There's one called Bolt Threads, who are making a mycelial fabric. There's another mycelial fabric company called MycoWorks. But I think the most exciting place to enter would be to go to some arts and architecture schools and to get to know the students, who many of whom are working on mycelial projects, architectural projects, and also art projects, and casting with mycelium as a kind of sculptural medium. And I think that would be probably the most fun, because there's the state of wild experimentation there. Yeah.
Hello, Merlin. Thanks for your talk.
Where are you?
I'd just like to ask you, I don't think you made any explicit reference to biochar, and what you think, you can talk about this subject in relation to the application of biochar for the express purpose of developing mycorrhizal networks. Is that something you can comment on, please?
I don't have that much to say on it. I know people have been researching this for a while. There was a lot of biochar excitement a few years back. I've always understood biochar as microbial hotels, providing a place for microbes to live, a kind of matrix to exist within in the soil. I've seen a photograph
in a book about biochar, where the biochar seemed to act like a super highway for hyphae, noticeably. Is this part of the key to its application in an agronomic context?
I can't give you a firm answer, but it strikes me as probable because it's very important that the physical matrix of the underground is very important to fungi. And they're these are maze-dwelling organisms who are used to navigating crowded rotscapes. And if you provide them with some kind of structure to grow in and around, they're going to have a nicer time of it than if you give them some hard, compacted, oxygen-free, water-free dead zone where it's difficult for them to physically grow. So I can see how biochar amendments to this kind of can help wake up the soil by providing space, real estate, for these organisms to explore.
Could you do some more work on it for us?
Sure.
Thank you, Merlin.
Okay, thank you both for your talk. That was great. I just wondered whether you had how many or whether you had discovered new fungi during your research.
I personally haven't, but I have many friends who have. I was just in Patagonia in Chile with one of them, Juliana Furci, who's an amazing mycologist, Chilean mycologist who started an organization called the Fungi Foundation and to try and get fungi included within conservation frameworks. And she's written the key guidebooks to Chilean fungi. And there was one, I was reading the guidebooks over there on the plane, and there's one I really wanted to meet. It's you may know Amanita muscaria, the red top with white flecks, a classic mushroom. There's one in the guidebooks called Amanita galactica, which has a black top with white specks, a bit like a hemisphere, a celestial planisphere. Very charismatic looking mushroom. And I said to Juliana, will we meet Galactica? And she said, Galactica, my favorite. I love Galactica. I found Galactica. I described Galactica. I named Galactica. When I first saw my, I was like, you are Galactica. It was amazing. I was like, wow, I want to meet Galactica. And she said, but I've never seen it again. The only time it's been described was the time I described it. I took 4 of them, and they're now the voucher specimens. We sequenced the DNA. It's its own branch, very distinct branch of the Amanitas, but no one has ever at least formally, no one who knows what they're looking for has found it since. This is very common. Many people, if you spend even a relatively small amount of time looking for mushrooms and caring about the systematics, you'll run into new ones.
Thank you. Fascinating. Speaking as a arable farmer, I'm just wondering how much we're shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of our soil health by applying seed dressings to corn and fungicidal seed dressings to corn and fungicides to the crop as it's growing.
I mean, this always seemed like a very peculiar thing to do. I tend to think from the perspective of the fungi, and I spent much of my adult life studying the relationships, the beneficial relationships that form between fungi and plants. So the idea of drenching plants with fungicide has always seemed a bit like maybe not the right way to go. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. I'm failing. But and we also cause trouble because when you do have a fungal infection that you then need to treat with a fungicide, you've bred, in fact, deliberately, maybe unintentionally, but nonetheless through deliberate action, you've bred a whole lineage of fungicide-resistant fungi, and you shot your future self in the foot. So I think there must be ways to change this. And you see it again in nurseries, in tree nurseries. Trees are brought up in sterile environments, sterilized environments, chemically sterilized environments with fungicide. Terrible place for a young tree to be. No opportunity to have your immune system conditioned by the fungi, which you will then go to be exposed to later on. No opportunity to form these beneficial associations. So I think we do a lot of harm with fungicides, and I look forward to seeing those paradigms start to shift.
Sorry. Oh, God. Thank you. Just speaking of citizen science and amateur mycology, what are the top tips you can give to farmers who don't have access to a lab to go out into their field and assess their mycorrhizal or just their fungal communities and potentially further the diversity of the fungal communities? Is there any sort of desktop tests that you can do without having access to labs?
There are new ways to do DNA sequencing yourself with desktop sequencers, but it's probably not the easiest way to go for most people, because you'd have to get into it, have to get into the analysis, and it'd be amazing if people did want to do that, but I suspect many people would have their hands full with other things. There are companies which are setting up, a bit like the companies who you can send off your stool samples and have your microbiome analyzed, and it sends back a profile of who you have living in your gut. And there are a few companies who are starting up to do that with agricultural soils. It would be more samples to pay for, but it would tell you who's there, and it would be a way to get a sense of some baseline before starting to shift a regime, for example. I'd say that would probably be the easiest way in.
Hi, thank you for an amazing talk. There's a lot of conversation about cancer and gene editing and how it's more and more individualized treatments, but in the magical fungi film, can't remember his name, but that amazing man cured his mother.
Paul
Thank
Stamets.
you, Paul. That's who you mentioned earlier. Where do you stand on that? Do you think this is the future for cancer? If so, is pharma going to go down that route, or is that something separate that ties back to psilocybin and the development of all of that side?
So many fungi have been used medicinally. Many of the fungi that you see around today, including the ones that Paul talked about, have been used medicinally for a very long time in parts of the world, have a long history of use for all sorts of things, including cancer. In Japan, some of these fungal compounds have found their way into mainstream medicine as cancer treatments. They tend to have been ignored in this part of the world. So I think it's really exciting to see people turning more towards these potential medicinal places, and not just with fungi, but with plants as well. And there needs to be more research, human clinical trials. A lot of the research that happens on these fungi is not in human clinical trials. It's with animal models or it's in cell culture. But to see what it does to humans, you have to give it to humans. But the problem is, for human clinical trials, it's hard to be motivated to do that if you don't have IP that you can then protect. And so there's this catch-22 with lots of so-called natural remedies where there's no evidence that they work, but there could be no evidence that they work because no one's going to do that study. No one's motivated to do that study. So I think there's all sorts of ways we could improve the situation. I mean, so it can be comparative effectiveness trials, for example, in medical environments, rather than test something against nothing, against placebo. What we really want to know is it better than the alternatives? And so level playing field studies where you compare all sorts of different potential remedies, maybe in combination and separately, I think would be really informative and illuminating. But someone's going to have to pay for it.
I think this will be the last one.
Thank you. Are there any aquatic or marine funguses, or are they just terrestrial?
It's a great question. There are loads of aquatic and marine fungi, and we know even less about these than we do about the terrestrial ones. And there are fungi that live in the bodies of crustaceans on the ocean floor, live on coral reefs, that live in conjunction with seagrasses and mangroves, that live in sulfurous sediments under the ocean, live in rivers, conduct all sorts of decomposition processes in water. You know, whenever you have organic matter to eat, you're going to find fungi there eating it. But they're very mysterious to us at this point in time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Merlin. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.